Hello, good evening, Professor Jodhka. Thank you so much for accepting the invitation. As you know that this lecture series is part of the larger ISS idea behind a research and book journey kind of a lecture series. The idea, as I shared with you, is to invite scholars to reflect and share either their research journeys or engage with the process of the making of the book. So the aim is to kind of demystify and inspire students in order to understand how have our scholars engaged with the idea of not only the doing of sociology but also the practice of sociology. So in this context, thank you, and this is the first lecture series in this kind of larger project. So I would like to start with, like, can you just share some kind of reflections based on your research journeys, your intellectual endeavors, and the kind of challenges that you have faced, or something, like just to know more about your work and the trajectory of it.
Good evening, Anurekha. Thank you very much for having me over. And this is a great honor to be inaugurating this discussion series. And I think these are very important initiatives that Indian Sociological Society has taken so that we can talk to each other even when we are not together. In some sense, online media provides us with that opportunity. Yeah, now I'm kind of been in academic life, research life for many years. I started my MPhil PhD in 1985-86, and now we are in 2024, so nearly kind of 40 years. But out of those 40 years, I've been teaching and working for a little more than 30 years. So over this period, obviously, I have published quite a lot. If one was to compare with the standards of Indian Academy, in India, people don't publish much. I mean, what I have published would perhaps not be seen as much if you were to compare yourself with people working in other countries. But I have published around 125 research papers, book chapters, and 21 books, which are both authored and edited. So, and it's been a kind of long journey, and it's also been a journey which is obviously very challenging and which obviously requires a lot of hard work. But it's also been excitement, when you publish something, people read, and when you see you are being cited by somebody or someone is talking about your book, and you kind of feel very happy about it, and also you feel like you're doing what you're supposed to do. So, and it's obviously at some level, uh, it's a progress. It's not something that you can start straight away. I remember when I published my first research paper in 1994, I think, in Economic and Political Weekly, that was on attached labor, which was from my PhD work. I was so happy, I was so excited, and now, obviously, even now when I send a paper to a journal, I mean, for a few weeks, one is very anxious what is going to happen, what they are going to say. So it has all those things. It's not like that anxiety goes away, whatever may be your status. So I think if one was to think of books, as I said, I've published quite a good number of books, and these are of different genre. It's not just one book. When we think about research books, we generally have these PhD theses that are kind of made into books. I published that as well. It was a long time back. My first book came, I think, in 96 or 95, which was from my PhD thesis. After that, for a long time, I did not publish books. I thought, and I think that's how most people would do in social sciences or even in sciences. Sciences, people don't publish books. But economists, for example, they are, or otherwise also professionally, we are judged on the basis of our research papers. In the long run, if you want to see what is your citation, what is your kind of circulation in the profession, research papers are considered as very, very critical, which are refereed. In the process, you also learn a lot. Generally, when we send a research paper, you get lots of comments, and we tend to feel very kind of depressed and low and annoyed sometimes. And that, I think, should actually be seen in the opposite manner. When you get lots of comments, That means the person who is trying to referee your paper has actually read it carefully. So don't take it seriously. Even rejection is not something that one should worry about. It would be rejected. My paper was also rejected. I remember when I sent a paper to Journal of Peasant Studies long time back. It came out later on in Oxford Development Studies. That was also an international journal. But the person gave me long comments, and then they said we will not be able to consider it. I was obviously sad about it, and not many papers have been rejected, but that was one thing which I remember. And I think one should prepare oneself, particularly at the early stage, because you're learning in the process. It's not something that is taught. Even research writing is not something that we are taught anywhere, right? Research writing is something that comes through practice. Even if we attend a kind of methodology course where we talk about it, it's not so simple. I mean, unless it's like what I teach in the methodology classroom. It's like learning music, right? Research is like learning music. Writing is like learning music. Unless you practice it, you cannot learn. You just read the language of music, you don't become a musician. Even if you kind of mug it up, you would not really become a musician. And even if you know how to play a sitar or a guitar, you don't become. You have to actually work very hard to figure out what kind of sound it would produce. So I think doing research, writing is that kind of an enterprise. I think that's what one should kind of, unless one is trying over and over again. Sometimes you have to write the same paper 3 times, sometimes 30 times. All that is what is required. And I've done that. Sometimes you write one para, and I would have kind of many times when you're starting your research paper, it takes like days and days and days, and finally you feel satisfied. And then when you read that also after 3 days, you feel, my God, it's all nonsense. You throw it away and you start all over again. So I think that's all normal, and we have to go through that. So my book publication, in some sense, starts in 2012, practically. So by that time, what I had done was, as I said, I published my PhD thesis. In between, I think there were 2 edited volumes, which one I published, which was actually a conference volume, conference that I organized in University of Hyderabad. It came out as a Community and Identities from Sage Publications, I think in 2001. But that was a conference volume. You have to work with people. But my own kind of books, not that conference volumes are not your own books, but that is kind of collaborative work, and that's a very different kind of work. That also requires a lot of work. So I remember in 2012, there are 2, 3 things that I was working on. By the time I'd started working on caste, so caste was something that people were actually looking for literature on. So I was invited by Oxford University Press to write a short introduction to the idea of caste. And they were starting this new series. It's actually called Oxford India Short Introductions. You're seeing the mirror image, so it's not very clear. But it's called Caste, Oxford India Short Introduction. And this was not really an academic book in the sense in which one would write academic books. This is a book that tries to, in some sense, put together academic work on caste in an accessible language, and that was the mandate I was given. And because I had been writing on caste, mostly research papers, they thought that I would be able to do this. This was a commission book, so different kinds of books. Sometimes you're asked by the publisher to write; it's easier. Then also you get comments, and sometimes it can also be rejected. But there are also books that you propose to publishers. So around that time, I was also working on putting together my work on caste, which was in form of research papers, and I prepared a research proposal. I communicated with 2 publishers, and Routledge was very keen to publish it, and that was this book, Caste in Contemporary India, which I'm kind of very proud of. And this, in some sense, uh, it was putting together my research papers. So you have in some sense books which are PhD theses converted into books. You have to rewrite them as books. Then you have books which are commission volume for a particular kind of purpose. And then most importantly, I think, are the books where we put together the research work we have done. My PhD was not on caste. I did not study caste for first, like say, 10, 12 years of my research career, even after joining. I started working on caste in 1999, 2000. So for like 10, 12 years, I had published around 10, 12 articles on different aspects of caste. These were empirical studies. I started with mapping untouchability in Punjab villages. Then I worked on corporate hiring. I also worked on Dalit activists. I worked on caste and democratic politics. Likewise, there are 8 or 10 different themes on which I had published research papers, and I thought they came together very well. And I had already worked on my own theoretical framework about caste. I was very unhappy with the way we used to teach caste in the classroom, taking from Louis Dumo and Orientalist kind of narratives of caste as a Hindu Varna hierarchy. So that was not caste for me. I had grown up in northwest India, Punjab, Haryana. Brahminism doesn't really matter much in Punjab. There are no Brahmins among Sikhs. There's no priestly caste among Sikhs. But caste exists in Punjabi villages, even in Punjabi society. So when I started thinking about caste, it was an important kind of exploration for me in my own context. So then I started looking at the question of caste from a wider kind of perspective. And by that time, by 1990s, the way we talk about caste also undergoes change. So then I kind of continued working in that kind of mode for several years, and I published, uh, apart from this book, a couple of other edited volumes, which was related to caste. One was a volume put together from papers published in Sociological Bulletin. Likewise, I published an edited volume with a very well-known political scientist called James Manner, which was on caste and power in the 21st century. It was published by Orient Black Swan. There's also advantage of being in Delhi, having been published by some good publishers. So that gives you credibility and makes it easier for you. It may not be equally easy for other people. So it's not been very difficult for me to access all the publishers, top publishers. So I think these are three different kinds of books that I've already talked about. There are books which are PhD theses, there are books which are commissioned books for on a particular subject, and there are books which are compilation of your research papers or edited volumes on a theme, which are all research papers, right? So this book, Caste in Contemporary India, is in sense collection of my own research, but the other books are collection of other people's research. Besides this, I think there's another book that I published recently, which again I'm very happy about. It's called Indian Village,
Yes.
Rural Lives in the 21st Century. Now, this book is not written for fellow academics. These are called as trade titles by publishers also. These are books written for popular circulation. So, as sociologists, we know what is happening to caste. As sociologists, we know what is happening to gender relations. As sociologists, we know what is happening to the larger field of violence and the kind of violence happens in society, how it should be understood. And we normally communicate it amongst each other. And these are issues which concerns everyone, right? They concern politics in a democratic society. They concern lay people. Question of gender, for example, when we talk about personal is political, it actually is very political. When it goes to lay persons and a woman realizes that the so-called intimate relationships or cultural codes that are taught to me by my family or the way we bring up our children, these are matters of socialization, and they are not questions of biological functions that we have to perform. It completely transforms us as persons. These are revolutionary, and these are not difficult to communicate. I mean, people already have these ideas. I remember when I was doing my field work on class relations, people who were working in rural Haryana, they could articulate about class inequality and exploitation in the kind of language that Karl Marx would use, right? So I think we should recognize that. And then there is a lot of things that we know about, which only we know about. Other people have some sense of it. But I think putting that for common audience is also a very important task that we have to do. It's very difficult. Writing in simple, accessible language is the most difficult thing to do. And I think when I wrote this book, it took me some time, and I've been thinking about it for the last 4 or 5 years. And finally, when I sat down during pandemic and started writing, again I would revise, and the publisher would say, no, no, these words you should take out. These
Mm.
are not words. Say, for example, if you're using the word anomy, people
Mm.
don't understand what is anomy.
Uh,
Or you use the word habitus. They say, no,
uh,
no, this is not.
it's
Use a language which is not. These are English speaking people.
more relatable kind
Yeah,
of.
more
Mm.
relatable. I think so. All that is, in some
Mm.
sense, is a journey which is journey of our discipline.
Mm.
This is also a journey of being a researcher, and in the process, I feel I have become much more, what one should say, ignorant. Right? You
Mm.
realize how little you know about the world, and you realize, there are 10 other things that I want to write books on, and then these are also things that get translated. Right? This book
Yeah.
is translated in Hindi recently. It's
Uh,
called Jati Badalte Paripreksh, and it has been published by Raj Kamal, which is the leading Hindi publisher. Before Hindi, it was translated into Tamil. And
oh.
likewise, my other book, Caste in Contemporary India, is translated in Chinese. Last month, I heard from my publisher that it has been actually published in Chinese, and it is available now on Chinese, Amazon, or whatever it's called. So I was very happy to see that. I mean, there's a great accomplishment that people in. So these translations also happen if you
Mm.
are consistently writing and you kind of
Yes.
make sense to people. So I think it's also communication. It's
Mm.
communication that happens both ways. And if you get feedback, then you respond to your referees, but also you have to respond to people who are reading your work, and you have to also look at the larger market. And
Mm.
this market is not only people who are buying books, there is also a publisher in between. And that
Yes.
publisher is also a very critical person. There are different
Yes.
kinds of publishers. There are corporate publishers like Routledge and Springer.
Mm.
There are university uh, uh,
Publishing.
books, Oxford University Press, university presses. And then there are small time, local publishers who would also take money from you and publish your book. So all those things are, is a kind of wider universe. And
Mm.
once you are in it, you get to know about these things.
Thank you so much. I mean, when you talked about ignorance, and then like thinking about like 21 books and 125 papers, and still you think that you are in this learning and unlearning mode, that's like very inspiring for many of us. Like, I think many of us like struggle to even bring out one book per se. Sometimes writing a research paper seems more doable because it's like 6,000, 7,000 words, but putting together 30,000 to like 90 to 1 lakh, so that becomes a major challenge. So in terms of the journey that you shared, which was so inspiring, and also the different kind of books that one engages with, there are two things that one could relate to. One, you talked about how, because there was this challenge of the kind of work that has been done on caste, and looking at your own classroom experience, and then teaching, and then and also the translations that you talked about, where Hindi, it's being translated to Hindi, or earlier it was translated to Tamil. So within this larger debate on vernacular traditions in sociology, how do you see that? I mean, for me, this is a very important question, because also being taught in Pune University, Savitribai Phule Pune University, where you have this whole discourse on the language question. So that, of course, now being based in Hyderabad Central University, this question doesn't come out so much, but it is still a core. And now you find students do talking about, questioning or engaging with vernacular tradition. So, how do you see yourself in this larger debate?
So briefly on your first comment that research paper is doable, I think
Uh,
that's a very important point. I think initially we should. That's what I was saying. Caste in Contemporary India was collection of my research papers. So
mm,
I think one should do doable things. If
mm,
one is writing PhD, you can always turn it into a book. But I
mm,
think doable things is what one should do initially. If
mm,
one is thinking of writing 10 chapters and publishing only a book, which is not a sensible idea.
mm.
If you publish 10 papers, you also appear in 10
Yeah,
journals, and
yeah.
they become your kind of resource,
Mm,
and people get to know about you through that. uh, yes, I mean, the question of vernacular tradition, I would say that it works at two levels. One is the teaching of sociology in local language, like you're talking about Marathi, or in North India it is in Hindi, or Tamil or Malayalam or Bangla, in the classroom, right? That I'm a little kind of unsure about. I don't know what should be my approach, because I'm a little apprehensive, because as a discipline, when we are doing sociology, we also kind of want to be available, accessible, or recognized by the larger world, right? Sociology or social science disciplines are by definition part of the larger academies and science, right? Even though we have local academic traditions, but we get recognized only when we are recognized globally. Right? And if that is the case, then there is also a question of hierarchy. So I am not very sure. I personally would not encourage that we should prefer teaching in the vernacular, even though vernacular becomes an easy way for students coming from local contexts, and they are more comfortable communicating. But I think sociology is also an expert domain, right? So if you have to learn music, you have to learn the language of music, and the language of sociology is also at some level, at this moment, it is English language, right?
Okay.
Historically, for example, in even in Germans, for example, now German people try to publish in English rather than publishing it in German, right? French scholars, even though they had their own language traditions, and they continue to have scientific tradition also. But we are kind of post-colonial societies, and that reality is not something at the individual level we can do much against. So if we are part or want to be part of this game, then one of the code that we have to master is the language. So it's all right to begin with your vernacular, but at the same time, it is very important, if you want to be in the game, you have to learn English language. And it is not difficult. I mean, we all learn languages, and as human beings, we are capable of learning languages. That doesn't mean that you become anglicized. That doesn't mean that you start thinking in English language. I don't remember a single paper which has been translated from Marathi or Hindi into English and published in a journal which is globally known. Literature, yes. You have fiction, which is autobiographies, which are translated and published, which have different things. But a research paper, or one research paper that is originally published in a vernacular language, or Hindi or Marathi or whatever, and then I feel compelled to read that, because without reading that, my understanding of the discipline is not enough. So I think that's something which we should remember. And this is important for new professionals who are coming into the discipline, to realize that if you want to be in the game, and then the game is a global game. For that global game, you need to know the local language, the code of the discipline. So I think one should try to communicate with all kinds of people, but at the same time, we all know any of the recognized sociologists in India today, if you have to find even one person who has written in a language other than English at the national level or the global level, you would not find any.
Yeah.
You would find literature people, people who write in Canada, for example. One of our friend recently got an international award, and she writes in Canada, right? So her writings are translated not only in English but in all kinds of languages in the world, right? So you have lots of people who in literature can move from, and that should be done in your own language, because that's about feeling, it's about your emotions. But when you're talking about science, then there is a language which others have to read, and the science academy is also a power game. So that power game is already controlled by the white Western culture, and we are also extension of that at some level. I'm not romanticizing it. I know the hierarchies of it. I know the politics of it, and even knowing that, after knowing that, we need to recognize that we are participating in that game. The moment we join discipline of sociology or chemistry or biology, so you can't just say that I would just work in my own language and I would become a good doctor. That doesn't happen. You have to learn the discipline entirely. So I have my kind of restrictions, but at the same time, when my book is translated in local language, I feel very happy about. And those who are writing in local language, I think it's all right to write in local language. but at the same time you recognize that it has a kind of there's a particular power structure, there's a particular
Mm,
domain.
mm.
You need to also learn to write in English, and it's not impossible, it's difficult.
Yes, yes.
It takes time, but learning language of sociology also takes time. It's a
Right.
conceptual language that also takes time. So that would be my kind of approach
Mm.
to vernacular.
No, I think this is important because the moment we think of English language as a skill to be learned,
Yeah.
and through that skill, at least try to engage with the larger power structures which are there with regard to language, and make an attempt to share our own arguments. That itself is an important kind of intervention that one could do, rather than saying that I wouldn't be learning that language.
Yeah.
So I think it has a major argument, but again, keeping in mind the even in terms of access to English language within the larger regional and rural urban context itself then becomes an important point that one needs to keep in mind. So again, going back to the book that you just recently published in terms of the Indian village, where you talked about books in the popular circulation. So, I mean, I don't know. Like I remember thinking about with regards to where earlier very established Indian scholars like A.R. Desai would talk about like writing for the public, or Burroway's work in terms of public sociology. So do you see it in that kind of context, or where would you place it with regard to the practice of our sociologists, these kind of books per se?
Yeah, see, I think there are two or three different modes in which one should think about it and one should write about it. One is the activist mode. So there are people who are change makers, for example, public sociology. I think A.R. Desai saw himself as an activist. And there are lots of people who would say that we are gender activists, caste activists, Dalit activists, feminist activists. So I think they write with a different kind of passion. And they obviously, some of them would bring questions of what is known, and in a manner that it becomes available to the larger politics of social transformation or social change. So I think that mode is a particular kind of mode, and which is absolutely legitimate. And for example, feminist writings in India have been written almost entirely in that mode initially. Kali for women and stuff like that. They were very committed to a cause, and I think just writing as women itself was politics, right? So
Yeah.
there is this kind of activist mode, which is very clearly, at some level also, the person who is writing has this self-image that I know what is the right way to go. So you're also trying to mobilize, and then obviously in the process you'll also have conversations, and people would react to that writing. We also have other social scientists, my colleagues in JNU, many of them write, and they're very passionate, and it also resonates with the concerns of common people, and that's how they become popular. They don't really become popular just because they see themselves as that is one mode of doing it. I mean, the other one is where you just want to kind of that, for example, when I wrote my book on Indian village, it was also a political project. It's not like it is not a political project, but I'm not a villager. I don't celebrate the rural. I am not a farmer. I don't celebrate agriculture or agrarianism. I am not a traditionalist, right? There are Gandhians who would write about village from a kind of traditionalist perspective, that village is the place where wisdom lies. But village is a very important category that we take for granted. We take for granted as a particular kind of social reality. Now, I know because of my work of last 35, 40 years that notion is a misnomer, and it miscommunicates, right? So I started working on it long time back. I think the first time I wrote on this was when I published a paper in EPW on Nation and Village, Images of Rural India and Gandhi, Nehru and Ambedkar. And that paper became very popular. It's
Yeah,
even
I
now
mean, just to
used.
interrupt you, I mean, I think in my own course on, like when I used to teach agrarian studies and rural sociology, I think that was like one paper that most of us could relate to,
Yeah,
and also like frame it in terms of how we also want to engage with.
Yeah.
I just wanted to say that.
Yeah.
Yes.
So that I develop in this book also as one chapter, how, nationalism is invested in the village, and how village becomes a kind of signifier of the authentic nation. And the main point is that how wrong it is. Right?
Mm,
So in this book, I also have a next chapter which is talking about the actually existing villages.
mm,
Now we have plenty of historical literature
mm,
which shows that this notion of India, this notion of rural, which was popularized by people like Gandhi, but
mm,
also accepted at some level by people like Nehru and Ambedkar
mm,
as the reality of India's past, had its own limitations, and it was actually borrowed from colonial or Orientalist writings.
mm,
Even though their notions are very different, Ambedkar engages with it very differently. But at the same time, all of them think that India always lived in villages, which was not true at all, right? Which was
mm,
empirically not the case, and village was never homogeneous. Marx also
mm,
thought that Indians lived in villages and they were all homogeneous villages. All that was
mm,
empirically incorrect. And I was not the first person to say that. Historians who had worked on 7th century BC, 7th century of the Common Era, or 15th century agrarian realities, they had written about it, that there was some notion of private property, villages were always open to outsiders, villages traveling. But most importantly, India had large urban population, always, right?
mm.
From Mohenjo-daro and
Yes.
Harappa.
Yes. Uh,
So that was something which I put together in this volume,
mm,
so that people can develop a conception of the rural which is more grounded, which is more
mm,
grounded in empirical research,
mm,
right?
mm,
And to realize that village is also a social construct,
mm,
village is also a conceptual construct, right?
mm,
And I was kind of, as I said, it's a political project. Even doing
mm,
that is political project, because I remember in 2000 when there was 2020 when the farmers movement was going on the borders of Delhi,
mm,
and the kind of ignorance,
mm,
it was intentional, which was present when economists and media people talked about it, and many of them
mm.
had not even read the laws, and they
Yeah.
didn't think
Yeah.
that it was required. Right? They had assumptions, and those assumptions
Mm,
were based on the arrogance they
mm,
acquired as middle class
mm,
persons. We
mm.
were talking about English language. When
Yeah.
we educate ourselves in English language, we think we already know everything.
Everything.
So that was the idea. So, and then I show how village has changed over a period of time, and lots of people have read. I remember one of its first review was published by very senior journalist from Andhra Pradesh, appeared in Tribune, and
Mm,
the concluding line was that everyone should read this book. I mean, I was very happy that, and it was, and then the title appeared in this is a kind of guide for the urban middle class audience, and that's what
mm,
my purpose was.
mm,
Urban middle class audience which thinks that it knows about everything. And
mm,
lots of people who know, they would dismiss this book even now. That's how
mm,
I also start in a conversation style,
mm,
talking to
mm,
somebody at India International Center, and the confidence he has about his own understanding of the village. Not that he is biased against or for
mm,
anything, but even then there is kind of sense of being kind of sure about it.
mm.
And the reality is that villages is still expanding.
Mm.
Urban is also has always been there, and it is also
Yeah.
expanding at a much faster
Mm,
pace.
mm, mm,
But we don't have the Western trajectory of
mm,
transformation. So just kind of the amount of knowledge that we have about gender, about caste, about village, about sexuality, about environment, about whatever courses that we teach, I think that also needs to be communicated to the larger public.
mm,
And that's where I think we need interlocutors, publishers. Some people write in newspapers, but
mm,
newspapers also require opinions. So
mm.
I think that's the second level, which is not necessarily an activist, but not necessarily not political. Everything is
Yeah.
political at some
Mm,
level. But this writing it in general language, simple language, is also a political act.
mm. Yeah. No, I mean, I kind of like, especially this whole where you talked about how there was a specific idea about writing for the middle class, like for them to come out of that ignorance. So I
Yeah.
think this is also something that, as teaching academic writing, also one talks to the students that like one can do a number of ways of writing,
Yeah.
and that is also contextual on the audience that you are writing for.
Yeah.
So the examples that you gave with regard to the newspapers,
Yeah.
or this kind of where you do draw upon this whole sociological historical literature on the idea of village,
Yeah.
but then demystify the whole process of how romanticized we have with regard to our idea of village. So I think, yeah, I mean, that review itself speaks a lot with regard to that kind of a trajectory. So, I mean, even just to even prepare for this conversation, looking at the various ways in which you have engaged with various different concepts and various different theories, what would be your, given the larger practice of the discipline of sociology in India, your take on the transdisciplinary kind of an engagement that had come up earlier in our conversation? Like how would you kind of locate yourself and your work within that?
Yeah, I mean, this is a very important question, and at some level, both it's kind of a sign of our success as a discipline, and at the same time, it also, in some sense, poses challenges to us. If you look at social sciences, I think sociology perhaps is the only discipline, sociology, social anthropology together, which lots of people want to read about, right? For example, if you are doing work in literature these days, uh, culture studies, for example, is mostly in English literature. So they would start with some anthropological texts. Even in engineering colleges, having some idea of sociology becomes very useful. Management is about society, and so sociology is not something which is just now confined to sociologists. Unlike economics, for example, economics also has acquired a language which is accessible only to economists, right? Or disciplines of science, they'll also have their own kind of limited kind of understanding and limited focus, and they write only for their own peer, right? And that's why I was publishing in Economic and Political Weekly. Most of my work has been published in Economic and Political Weekly. The advantage is that you also have journals like EPW, which are read by all kinds of academics, and which is possible only perhaps in countries like India, right? If you're working in anthropology in Princeton or in Chicago, so your work is likely to be read only by fellow anthropologists, but not in case of, I think, we have that kind of advantage where our writings are read by people outside our discipline as well, provided we have something to say which they find interesting. So I think that becomes very critical because at some level, say, as sociologists, when I've been working on, say, for example, question of caste, but question of caste is also a question of economy. It's not simply a question of ritual hierarchy. That's why my work, in some sense, pulls caste out of its comfort zone of Hindu ritual systems to corporate hiring, to Dalit trying to get into business, to democratic politics, to actual struggles in a village in Punjab over gurudwaras. So all those things are about the materialities of caste. Now, when we talk about materialities of caste, we can easily, obviously, economists also then become interested in this. It's around that time that economists began to study. And we realized that economists have a method of studying discrimination. We didn't really have a language of discrimination. And that was very useful for me, that how caste is about discrimination. For example, question of exclusion comes up, question of denial, that again in the 90s, these are categories which are either coined by administrators in Europe or by economists. Amartya Sen talks about exclusion in the famous paper that he wrote for Asian Development Bank, and how then it becomes available to us to study caste. Before that, we never used the word exclusion for caste, discrimination for caste, denials for caste. So it also gives us a different frame. So it's a kind of very interesting journey. And likewise, when you talk to economists, and they are using categories like SC/ST as one caste category, you say, no, this is not caste. And they have to listen to us. Caste is a relational structure. If it is a relationship, then you have to understand caste in a qualitative language. You can't always, and they at least recognize that there are limitations, but our data is trying to say something. And I think that is something that we can also draw from them. So I think these interdisciplinary conversations are very useful for everyone. Likewise, you're working on gender, for example, labor participation. The way economists will frame the question of labor participation can actually be very blind to relational structures of patriarchy. It could also be oppressive for women. What do you mean by labor participation? You already have so much work Does
Uh-huh.
it get compensated by working outside, right? So you would raise very interesting
Mm.
questions, and then they are also required to confront those questions. Just because labor participation is not going to tell you that this is higher empowerment of women. This may actually be
Mm.
more exploitation of women in a
Exploitation.
different way, right?
Yeah. Yeah. No, I mean, the kind of ideas or the kind of experiences that you're sharing is very interesting. Just like, I mean, before the last question, I'm just like adding one. It's like, based on your, I mean, one can see when you talked about, 30, 40 years of experience, research, just a little bit on the teaching. I mean, because that's something that I'm very invested in. So, in terms of your teaching experience, especially with regard to your own intellectual journey, I mean, also that the fact that you're based in JNU, which is for many of us a very inspiring, kind of a place one always looks up to, like always, or even desires to go and either study there or work there. So, what it means, I mean, to be placed there in terms of your teaching. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, there are privileges, no doubt about it. I'm privileged. You are also privileged, right?
Yes.
When we were talking about Pune University, or
Uh,
I also studied in Pune University. I did my MA in sociology from Pune
yes.
University. So at that time, Pune was very different. There is also a kind of larger churning happening in society, and that transforms academic institutions. And we have to be part of the same kind of process. We are not outside it.
Mm.
So, say in Hyderabad University, where I started my teaching career in 1991, we were told that you can design your course.
Mm.
Even though there were course title given to us, there was no restriction. If I was to teach in Delhi University College, I would be given a course outline.
Mm.
Or even in perhaps Pune
Mm.
University, we are given a kind of course outline, and that course outline requires you to also use certain prescribed readings. Right?
Mm.
So I think there are challenges and limitations that you have to kind of encounter in different contexts, and those contexts vary. And being in University of Hyderabad, I got this habit of doing the way I want to. So largely we are working in the same discipline. Like for
Mm.
example, in JNU, I have been teaching this course on Indian society.
Mm.
It was a very different course. I initially taught on rural India and agrarian change, some compulsory courses. But this is a course that I've been trying to work on. I've designed it. I change it every time I teach it. So initially we think of Indian society means you would teach all those 4 or 5, 6 standard readings, and there
Mm.
would be 5 or 6 separate topics. But my
Mm.
research on caste, for example, was very useful for me. My research on
Mm.
village was very useful for me. I reframed, I kind of dug up those writings, which would help me. And I think this gives a very different kind of exposure to students.
Mm.
Then it kind of also gels with other courses.
Mm.
So my only kind of, for a brief period, I tried to be accessible to students, try to speak in a language, or try to give them limited amount of reading, which was a mistake.
Mm.
And I think we should challenge students.
Yeah.
We should try to, even if there is a prescribed reading, I would
Mm.
say that these are 3 other articles I want you to read.
Mm.
So out of say 25 students, even 3 of them read,
Mm.
that's good enough.
Yeah.
So I think we should push them
Mm.
and try to kind of take them very seriously
Mm.
as intellectuals, as fellow academics.
Mm.
And I'm sure that those who stay back in research would do better work than us.
Yeah. Yeah.
So given that we have brought the discipline to this level, and now this is already known, you have to kind of go further.
Mm.
And obviously, if the world is changing, their challenges would be different. Their own personal bringing up, for example,
Mm.
in our generation, it was much more difficult to access material, right? You did not have access to lots of books and articles.
Mm.
Now you just go to the computer, you
Yeah.
can download books, you can access journals, you can access articles. Even if the specific book is not available, something or the other of the same author would be
Yeah.
available.
Yes.
Our student would write to the author sitting in some American university, and they would send them paper,
Send
right?
them.
So
Yeah.
all that is now become possible, and this generation is also smarter and more confident. So I think the possibilities are many, and then that is also in some sense part of this this process, and one should kind of work with that.
Yes, yes. Yeah, I mean, your point in terms of like how this generation is like more confident. I mean, especially now, see when the master students, the way they engage in the classroom, the kind of questions they ask. I mean, I don't think that when I was doing my masters, I was even thinking of those questions. You know, like, so I think, yeah, it's a different generation, and the kind of, not only they are challenging themselves, like as teachers also we need to challenge, but they also seem to challenge us in terms of like reading more and coming to the class to challenge them. So, Professor Jodhka, last question here is like, because this whole series is kind of framed or anchored within this whole idea about demystifying writing. I think that's something that most of us, even students, feel in terms of hesitant, or there's a kind of a block which is there. Some of them write very, I mean, they find it easy, but some kind of still find it a challenge to engage with writing. So, given your large, I mean, the way that you have written, the number of books that you have, so how would you kind of say to the research student and practitioners, like with regard to how do they approach academic writing? Yeah.
So I think, again, there are the two kind of ways one can talk about it. I think one should also uh, recognize that research writing is a very different kind of writing, and it requires a lot of training, a lot of effort. You need to have done research in order to do research writing, and you need to have done research along with knowing about the research which has already been done in that field, right? So if you have these two things, and then you need to say something which is perhaps different or new, or even if it is the same thing, but these two things are very, very essential, that you should know the basic literature available in that field. That is review of literature, as we call. You have to have some method, but most importantly, you have to have something to say. I've also seen people who write any random thing and they think that it should be published. So there's also other extreme who don't take writing as a challenge. They think that they are born wise and they can write anything, and that should be treated as serious research. And they talk to 5 people and then they say that I have already done research. So I think research, that's why PhD is like 4 years project, 5 years project in learning to do research. And that is something which one has to take seriously. Some people who say that, I'm in BA 3rd year and I'm writing a research paper. So that's something which alarms me, right? So one should not even, otherwise, if you're in MA and writing a term paper and you want to publish it, some people write, those kinds of opinion pieces, but you should recognize these are only your opinions based on some kind of elementary research, some kind of review of literature. So you should not rush into it. It takes time. You have to have some material which is based on sound research, which follows certain methodology, and also has an idea about what others have done. Otherwise, once you go out in public and write something, people will stop taking you seriously. Also, it's a kind of you're making yourself a kind of brand. So that brand, as I said, I never get no from publishers, because they know, he's published so much, we should look at his proposal at least. They may not accept it, but at the same time, they would come and tell you, sorry, I'm kind of, we already have a book in this. We are not really interested. Would you have something else for us? Or something else, somebody else will be willing to publish it. So I think one should invest in oneself, and one should realize that one has to take research seriously.
So, I think thank you so much. It was a great, learning experience to have this conversation, and hopefully, I think the series would help us in order to understand each other's journey and try to see like how best we can engage with the practice of sociology itself. Yeah. So, Thank you
so much, Anurekha, for wonderful questions and engaging discussion.
Yes.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Thank you.